I finally understand. Trust begins before words.
Vela Transit Solutions was incorporated in 2352, 19 years before the Ashkeleth incident, with a founding charter that read, on its surface, like 1,000 other mid-sized logistics ventures chasing the sudden expansion of humanity's trade frontier. It listed a modest fleet of 6 vessels. It projected, in its initial filings, a slow and unremarkable decade of growth servicing the outer relay stations that larger, more established carriers considered too marginal to bother with. This was, in the specific and deliberate sense that mattered, the entire point. Project Threshold had been conceived 2 years earlier, in the aftermath of an incident along the Corvid Reach that United Earth Defense Command's own internal historians would later describe, with the flat understatement that characterized most Threshold documentation, as instructive. A UEDC survey vessel had been detained on manufactured grounds by a minor regional authority, held for weeks while diplomatic channels moved at the glacial pace diplomatic channels always moved at, and released only after a show of naval force so disproportionate to the original offense that it had cost United Earth more in regional goodwill than the detained crew's freedom had been worth to recover. Admiral Marcus Webb, then a captain, had sat on the review board convened to examine that incident, and had said, in the closed session that nobody outside the room was ever meant to hear about, the sentence that would eventually become the founding premise of everything that followed. "We keep solving small problems with large answers," he said, "because large answers are the only tool we've built. We need a tool shaped like the problem." The tool once built did not look like a tool at all. It looked like a shipping company. This was deliberate, and it required a kind of institutional patience that most military doctrine simply was not built to sustain. A warship deters through visibility. A network of quiet, dormant, patiently distributed instruments deters through the opposite. It must never be seen, never be suspected, and never be used except in the exact narrow circumstance its architects had designed it for years, sometimes decades, before it did anything at all. Vela Transit Solutions grew exactly the way a real logistics company grows. It won contracts on merit. It paid competitive wages. Its ships were maintained to genuine commercial standards, flown by genuine commercial crews who had no knowledge of and no need to know about the second purpose their routine deliveries served. This was not incidental to the design. It was essential to it. A crew that knew what they were truly carrying might, however unintentionally, behave differently, and difference was the one thing the entire architecture could not afford. Captain Idris Bello flew the Thessaly corridor the way any competent captain would fly it, cautiously, professionally, and with a healthy respect for the region's occasionally arbitrary enforcement culture. He was, in the fullest and most literal sense, exactly who his employment record said he was. That his 41 prior transits through Ashkeleth had also, without his awareness, built the specific instrument that would eventually free him was a fact that even Dr. Nkosi Webb found, on the nights she allowed herself to think about it too long, almost unbearably strange. By 2371, Vela Transit Solutions operated across 11 corridors, employed just under 9,000 people, and had never once in 19 years been publicly connected to United Earth Defense Command in any capacity. Its ships were exactly as boring as they appeared. That was the entire architecture of its power. The VTS Meridian Accord was 6 hours from the Thessaly corridor when the hail came through. It was not a warning, it was a formality. The Sarivane Concord did not warn ships it intended to seize. It informed them afterward that the seizure had been lawful. The Meridian Accord was a civilian relay hauler, registered to Vela Transit Solutions, carrying refined tellurium alloy, medical isotopes, and 12 crew who had made this run 41 times without incident. On the 42nd run, A conquered customs cutter dropped out of slip space directly across her bow and ordered her to power down for inspection. Captain Idris Bello complied. Compliance was standard doctrine for Vela crews operating inside contested corridors. Non-resistance had kept Vela ships and Vela people alive for 11 years of friction with the Conquered's border enforcement. It was, in its own quiet way, a strategy, though very few of the people who executed it ever thought of it that way. They simply thought of it as being reasonable. The Conquered Cutter's boarding team found nothing illegal because there was nothing illegal to find. They manufactured a discrepancy anyway. A cargo manifest timestamp, they said, did not match the corridor transit log by 4 minutes. 4 minutes was under. Conquered Trade Statute, sufficient grounds to classify the vessel as engaged in unregistered smuggling. Captain Bello and 11 crew were removed from the Meridian Accord and transferred to Relay Station Ashkeleth, a Conquered customs and processing hub built into the hollowed core of an Orpor asteroid at the mouth of the corridor. The ship itself was impounded. Her cargo was seized under forfeiture. Her crew was placed in administrative detention, a Conquered euphemism for a holding cell with worse food. None of this was reported by any Conquered authority to Earth, to the United Earth Defense Command, or to Vela Transit Solutions. Under the Conquered's own internal procedure, foreign detainees were entitled to notification of their government within 72 hours. 72 hours came and went. Ashkeleth Station Administrator, a mid-tier customs official named Prevolt Wren, simply did not file the notice. It was easier not to. Filing the notice invited oversight. Oversight invited questions about the 4-minute discrepancy, which did not hold up to any scrutiny more serious than the scrutiny Wren had personally applied to it, which was none. Prevolt Wren had been processing seized cargo through Ashkeleth for 9 years. In that time, he had detained crews from 6 species. He had never once had a detention challenged in a way that cost him anything. The Conquered's border enforcement apparatus ran quietly and almost without friction on exactly this kind of small, unaccountable extraction, repeated often enough across enough stations that it amounted, in aggregate, to a significant fraction of the region's informal economy. Nobody at the top of the Conquered hierarchy ordered it. Nobody at the top needed to. The incentives did the ordering for them. Wren assumed reasonably, based on 9 years of undisturbed practice, that the crew of the Meridian Accord would spend a few weeks in holding, that Vela Transit Solutions would eventually notice a missing ship and file a claim through the appropriate channels, that the claim would be processed with the appropriate delay, and that by the time anyone with actual authority looked closely at the case, the tellurium alloy would have already been sold and the medical isotopes would have already decayed past any usable threshold, rendering the entire question moot. This was a reasonable assumption. It had been correct every other time. It was about to be the single worst assumption of Prevolt Wren's professional life. Inside Ashkeleth's detention block, the 12 crew of the Meridian Accord had organized themselves within the first few hours into the quiet, practical routines that people who have spent years working together in confined spaces tend to fall into almost without discussion. Captain Bello took the corner nearest the door because it was the coldest, and because he had always taken the coldest bunk on every ship he had ever commanded, a habit none of his crew had ever asked him to explain and all of them had noticed. The youngest member of the crew was a systems engineer named Talia Osai, 26 years old, on her 3rd contract with Vela Transit Solutions and her first experience of anything resembling detention. She spent the first night convinced, with the specific certainty of the young, that no one beyond the 12 of them would ever know what had happened, that Ashkeleth would process them quietly and permanently the way certain remote authorities were rumored to do, and that the manifest discrepancy would stand forever as the official explanation for whatever became of them. Bello found her sitting against the cell's rear wall sometime past what the station's lighting cycle suggested was midnight, and sat down beside her without being asked. They logged the transit times wrong on purpose, she said. I checked them myself before we left dock. There was no 4 minutes. I know, Bello said. Then why aren't you angrier? Bello considered the question for longer than she expected him to. I've flown this corridor 41 times, he said finally. I've watched them do this to 5 other crews before us. Every time I told myself it wasn't my problem to fix because I couldn't fix it, and being angry about a thing you can't fix mostly just wears you down faster than the thing itself does. He looked at the cell door. But I'll tell you what I do believe, and I believe it because the company's never given me a reason not to. Vila doesn't lose ships quietly. Somebody back home already knows this ship stopped answering its check-in call. It might take days, it might take longer than we'd like, but somebody knows, and knowing is the first half of anything getting fixed. He did not know, could not have known, that somebody already did know, that a xenopolitical systems analyst in Geneva had read the anomaly flag 6 hours earlier, and was, at that exact moment, drafting the demand that would end the detention entirely, or that the ship's own cargo. Housing, unloaded and stacked in Ashkelith storage bays not 40 meters from where they sat, held the specific instrument that would make the ending possible. He said it because he believed, in the plain, unglamorous way that most Vila crews came to believe it after enough years with the company, that the people above him took the safety of the people below them seriously. And that belief, though he never once thought of it in these terms, was itself a kind of evidence for a system working exactly as it had been quietly designed to work. Talia did not fully believe him, but she stopped counting the hours out loud after that, which Bello privately considered a kind of progress. Vila Transit Solutions was, on its corporate registration, a mid-sized interstellar logistics company headquartered in the Sol system, operating 412 vessels across 11 trade corridors. This was true. It was also, and had been for 19 years, the primary logistics contractor for a classified United Earth Defense Command initiative that did not appear on any public budget line, referenced in internal UEDC correspondence only as Project Threshold. Nobody at Vila Transit Solutions below the rank of Senior Fleet Coordinator knew this. Captain Idris Bello did not know it. His crew did not know it. They flew their routes, delivered their cargo, filed their manifests, and had no reason to believe they were anything other than exactly what their paychecks said they were: employees of a logistics company. They were also, without their knowledge, 41 successful data relay operations into a 19-year program that had quietly turned every regular Vila Transit Solutions trade route into an extension of United Earth Sensor Network. This was Project Threshold's first and most patient innovation. Nothing about it required weapons. It required only that a civilian shipping company fly its normal routes, on its normal schedule, carrying, in addition to its normal cargo, a class of passive instruments small enough to be indistinguishable from ordinary hull sensors, cheap enough to be replaced without anyone asking why, and useless in isolation. What made the instruments valuable was not any one of them. It was all of them together, quietly building a picture, corridor by corridor, station by station, of exactly how the region's traffic actually moved, who actually controlled what, and where the seams in every border authority's coverage actually were. Ashkelith was one of 1,200 stations in the Threshold Network's passive coverage. The Meridian Accord seizure was logged automatically, flagged by an anomaly detection routine that noticed a scheduled Vila transit had failed to clear its exit checkpoint, and forwarded, without human intervention, to a duty analyst at UEDC's Corridor Oversight Desk in Geneva. The duty analyst's name was Dr. Amara Nkosi-Webb. She read the flag at 3:40 hours local Geneva time on a Tuesday. She read it twice. Then she picked up a secure line and made a call that Prevost Ren, 600 light-years away and entirely unaware that he existed as a subject of anyone's attention, would never know had happened, and that would end his career within the month. Dr. Amara Nkosi-Webb had spent 14 years at UEDC's Corridor Oversight Desk, a posting that most of her academy classmates had considered, gently and without malice, a waste of her talent. She had graduated top of her class in xenopolitical systems modeling. She could have had a command track posting, a research chair, a seat on the Compact Oversight Council's advisory board. Instead, she had chosen a desk job monitoring shipping patterns, because she had understood something early in her career that most of her classmates had not. That in a galaxy where every major power measured strength in warships, the side that actually understood the shipping lanes, the customs stations, the border seams, and the small unaccountable extractions that made up the real texture of interstellar life would always know things the warship counters did not. She called Admiral Marcus Webb, her husband of 11 years and also entirely coincidentally, the officer currently serving as UEDC's Director of Corridor Operations. They did not discuss work at home. They discussed it now at 3:41 hours because this was not home, this was a secure line, and Amara's voice had the particular flatness she used only when something mattered. 12 of ours are in a conquered holding cell at Ashkilith, she said. 76 hours, no notification, cargo already logged as forfeited, it's Ren. The customs administrator. He's done this 11 times in 9 years that we have logged. 6 different crews, 6 different species. He has never once been challenged. He is not doing anything unusual, Marcus. That's what makes it useful. Admiral Webb understood immediately what she meant, because it was, in a sense, the entire philosophy Project Threz. Hold had been built around. An enemy who does something unusual is alert to consequence. An enemy who does something habitual, something that has never once cost him anything, does not expect the ground to move. Prevault Ren was not a strategist. He was a small, tired, unimaginative man doing the same small, unaccountable thing he had done 11 times before, confident in the mathematics of his own impunity. That confidence was the target. Bring in the desk, Webb said. Full workup. I want everything Threshold has on Ashkilith, on Ren personally, on the Concord's regional customs command structure, and I want the response doctrine drafted before local mourning. You know what the doctrine will say. I know what it always says. I want to hear you say it anyway. Amara closed her eyes for a moment, the way she always did before stating the thing that had governed every action UEDC had taken in a contested corridor for the past 2 decades. It was not a slogan. It had never been written on a banner or spoken in a recruiting broadcast. It existed in exactly one classified document, revised 4 times since its original drafting, referred to internally by everyone who worked with it simply as the ledger. Proportional and total, she said. We take back exactly what was taken plus the cost of taking it, not 1 credit more, not 1 life lost if it can possibly be avoided, and once the account is closed, it stays closed. No further escalation, no continued pressure, no attempt to extract advantage from the incident beyond correcting it. We are not interested in dominance. We are interested in being, provably and repeatedly, more trouble to wrong than to leave alone. And if they don't believe the account will actually be closed, then we open it in front of everyone, and we close it in front of everyone, and we let the closing do the persuading. Marcus was quiet for a moment on the line, and Amara recognized the particular silence of a man weighing a professional decision against something more personal, though he would never have described it that way to anyone but her. 12 people, Amara, Bellows crew, I pulled their files while you were talking. There's a systems engineer on that manifest, 26 years old, this is her 3rd contract. She has a mother in Lagos who calls the company's family liaison line every time a scheduled check-in runs more than 6 hours late. That call is going to come in soon if it hasn't already. I know, Amara said. I read the same files. That's not a reason to move faster than the doctrine allows, Marcus. It's a reason to make sure we don't get it wrong. If we move on instinct instead of process, we risk exactly the kind of overcorrection that cost us so much goodwill after the Corvid reach. The whole reason Threshold works is that it is never impulsive, not even now, especially not now. He accepted this the way he had accepted it every other time across 14 years of exactly this kind of conversation, not because it was easy, but because he had watched the doctrine hold case after case, precisely because neither of them had ever let the human urgency of a given moment shortcut the discipline the whole system depended on. "Draft it," he said. "I'll have corridor operations ready to authorize the moment you have language." He paused before ending the call and added in the quieter register he reserved only for her, "Tell her mother, if it comes to that, that we already know. Nobody in Lagos should spend one more hour thinking otherwise than they have to." 6 time zones away, in a station carved into a dead asteroid, Prevault Wren finished his evening processing log, noted the Meridian Accord's cargo for scheduled auction in 11 days, and went to sleep without dreaming of anything at all, because as far as he understood the universe, there was nothing coming. The response doctrine that reached Admiral Webb's desk by 900 was, in the tradition of every threshold doctrine before it, almost insultingly precise. It did not call for a fleet. It did not call for a diplomatic protest, though one would be filed purely as a formality, purely for the record, and purely because Amara Nkosi Webb believed procedure mattered even when everyone involved understood procedure would not be what solved the problem. It called for the return of 12 people, the return of one ship, the return of the seized cargo or its exact market equivalent, and a formal correction to the customs record clearing the Meridian Accord's registration of any wrongdoing. 4 items, nothing more. The doctrine also specified, with the same precision, what would happen if the 4 items were not delivered inside a defined window. The window was 96 hours from the moment the demand was transmitted. This was not an arbitrary number. It was calculated, as every threshold deadline was calculated, from the minimum time a rational actor in Wren's position would need to independently verify that the threat behind the demand was real, weigh it honestly against the cost of compliance, and act. 96 hours gave him time to check. It did not give him time to stall. The demand was transmitted not to Prevault Wren, who lacked the authority to act on it even if he had wanted to, but to Regional Customs Director Vael-Korr, 3 tiers above Wren in the Concord's administrative hierarchy. A woman who had built a 22-year career on never once making a decision that could be traced back to her personally. She received the transmission at her office on Concord Prime, and read it with the particular irritation of someone being asked to clean up a mess she had never known existed. She had in fact never heard of Prevault Wren before that morning. Ashkeleth was one of 41 stations under her nominal authority. She could not have named its administrator if her career had depended on it, which, within the week, it very nearly would. Korum's first instinct, entirely typical of a 22-year career built on deflection, was to treat the demand as noise. Human polities filed protests constantly. Most protests went nowhere because most polities lacked either the will or the capacity to back them with anything. She drafted a standard acknowledgement, the kind of content-free diplomatic reply that had successfully absorbed dozens of prior complaints from a dozen prior species. And she would have sent it within the hour if her deputy, a younger and more careful officer named Sethvan Ilarak, had not stopped her. "Director," he said, "you should look at the attachment before you reply." The demand had come with an attachment. It was not a threat, not in any language the Concord's legal apparatus would have classified as one. It was a single navigational chart of the Thessaly corridor, annotated with 211 small markers, each one representing a location. Beside each marker, a timestamp and a cargo manifest number. All 211 markers traced, in unbroken sequence going back 19 years, the full documented movement history of Vela Transit Solutions vessels through Concord-administered space. Ilarak had spent 4 minutes staring at it before he understood what he was looking at. It was not a threat of force. It was a demonstration of visibility. It said without a single hostile word that a species the conquered had spent 2 decades quietly extracting small unaccountable advantages from had, for the entirety of that time, been watching, recording, and understanding the conquered's own internal shipping and enforcement patterns in more granular detail than the conquered's own regional customs office apparently possessed about itself. They are telling us, Ilarak said slowly, that they know our corridor better than we do. Coram took the chart from him and studied it herself, tracing the small markers with one finger across nearly 2 decades of her own regional command's shipping history, most of which she recognized only in the vaguest institutional sense, filed away in reports she had signed without reading closely, because signing reports without reading them closely was, if she was honest with herself, most of what her 22-year career had actually consisted of. It could be fabricated, she said, though without much conviction. A sufficiently motivated intelligence service could construct something that looked like this without actually possessing the underlying access. It could, Ilarak agreed, but consider the cost of being wrong in either direction. If we assume it is fabricated and it is real, we have just demonstrated to a power capable of watching our entire corridor in this kind of granular detail that we did not take the demonstration seriously enough to even verify it. If we assume it is real and it is fabricated, we have lost nothing but the pride of releasing 12 smugglers who probably were not smugglers to begin with. He paused. There is no version of this calculation, Director, where dismissing it costs us less than examining it. Coram did not send the content-free reply. She sat with the chart for a long time, and then she did something that would later be examined at length by a conquered internal review board. She forwarded the demand and its attachment upward to Fleet Marshal Osavain Threll, commander of the Conquered's 3rd Border Fleet, requesting guidance. This decision, born of genuine uncertainty rather than genuine judgment, would prove to be the second worst decision made in the Ashkeleth affair. It would not, however, be the worst. That distinction belonged to Fleet Marshal Threll himself. Fleet Marshal Osavain Threll had commanded the 3rd Border Fleet for 11 years. In that time, he had never lost a ship, never lost an engagement, and never once encountered a species along the Thessaly frontier willing to escalate a border dispute past the point of a strongly worded transmission. He had built, on this record, a professional identity. As the man who kept the frontier calm through strength alone, and he had come to believe, the way career soldiers sometimes come to believe things that flatter them, that the calm was a product of his deterrence, rather than a product of the simple fact that nobody along his frontier had previously had a reason to test it. He read Coram's forwarded demand with something close to contempt. 12 smugglers and a discrepant manifest, he said to his staff, and they send us a map. He found this genuinely somewhat funny. They want us to be impressed that they can count our ships. His intelligence officer, a cautious veteran named Vithra Corson, who had served under 3 previous fleet marshals and had learned across that service exactly how much weight to put behind the word cautious in her own internal assessments, attempted to raise the matter of Earth's documented military conduct along other frontiers. She was aware, in the vague way that most conquered officers were aware, of certain incidents involving human forces at other borders, incidents that circulated through conquered intelligence channels as rumor more than verified record, because Earth's public military communications tended to be sparse, and its classified operations tended to stay classified. There are reports, Corson said carefully, of engagements in which human forces demonstrated capability significantly beyond what their published fleet strength would suggest. I would recommend caution before dismissing this. Reports, Threll said, from species with every incentive to inflate the reputation of a power that might one day be useful to invoke against us. I have 11 years of direct experience with this frontier, Corson. I have never seen a human warship pass the outer relay markers. I have never seen credible evidence that they maintain a fleet capable of projecting force this far from Sol. What I have seen is a demand letter and a shipping chart, and I am not going to instruct a regional customs director to release a legitimate detention because someone sent us a pretty map. Corson did not argue further, though she made a note in her own private log rather than any official record of the exact time and the exact phrase Threll had used, a habit she had developed under her second fleet marshal and never fully broken. It was not insubordination. It was simply the accumulated caution of someone who had watched confident men be wrong before and had learned that the wrongness was easier to explain afterward if someone had written down what was said beforehand. Threll's operations officer, a younger man named Davis Corinth who owed his position largely to Threll's patronage and was consequently disinclined to contradict him, offered instead a kind of validation Threll had not asked for but accepted readily. With respect, Marshal, even if the reports about human capability elsewhere are accurate, this frontier isn't Sol space. 19 light years is 19 light years. Whatever they can do at their core worlds, projecting it out here would take weeks even under the most generous slipspace assumptions. We would see it coming. This assessment, technically accurate as far as it went, rested on the same unexamined premise that had governed Threll's entire 11-year command. That force worth worrying about had to be projected from somewhere else, rather than already sitting, quietly, inside the very stations under discussion. Nobody in the room considered the possibility that the demonstration might already be present, because nobody in the room had any reason to imagine a deterrent shaped like 19 years of ordinary cargo deliveries. This was not a failure of intelligence in the conventional sense. It was a failure of imagination about what patience, applied at sufficient scale and for sufficient time, could actually accomplish. And it was a failure the conquered's entire military doctrine shared, because the conquered had never once in its long history built anything resembling it. He drafted the response personally, which was itself unusual, and which several of his staff would later cite in the aftermath as the moment they should have said something and did not. The response, transmitted to UEDC's corridor oversight desk 14 hours before the 96-hour window closed, was brief. It rejected the demand in full. It characterized the detention as lawful and the customs finding as valid. It noted with what Amara Nkosiweb would later describe as almost admirable specificity that the conquered considered the matter closed, that further transmissions on the subject would not receive a response, and that the Third Border Fleet stood ready to defend conquered sovereign process against. And here the translation software rendered the original conquered phrase with unusual literalness, any external party mistaking patience for permission. Amara read the response twice. Then she forwarded it to her husband with a single-line ata. Ojed. They picked the deadline for us, she wrote. 14 hours early, that's either confidence or panic. Either way, we don't wait for the window. We move now while they still believe nothing is coming. What Fleet Marshal Threll did not know, could not have known, and would spend the remainder of his career failing to fully explain to a review board that did not particularly want excuses, was that Project Threshold had never depended on force projected from Sol. Its entire architecture had been built around the opposite premise. That force projected across 19 light years takes too long, costs too much, and announces itself too clearly to be useful as a deterrent against small, habitual, unaccountable extraction of exactly the kind Prevault Wren had practiced for 9 years. Instead, Threshold had spent 19 years placing its answer inside the extraction itself. Every one of the 211 documented Vela transit solutions transits through conquered space had carried, in addition to its passive sensor package, a second class of instrument, smaller still, dormant by default and functionally indistinguishable, to any inspection short of a full structural disassembly, from ordinary cargo hold environmental regulators. Ashkeleth Station, in particular, had received 41 Vela deliveries over 11 years, each one leaving behind, embedded in cargo housing that was subsequently unloaded, inventoried, and stored in the station's own long-term holding bays, a passive relay node. 41 nodes, all dormant, all indistinguishable from junk. All still there because Ashkeleth storage bays, like most custom storage bays across the Conquered's frontier, held on to old cargo housing for years rather than recycling it. Out of the same small bureaucratic inertia that had let Prevault Wren detain 6 crews across 9 years without consequence. This was the shape of Project Threshold's actual genius, and it was not a genius of weapons. It was a genius of patience applied at a civilizational scale. Where the Conquered's Third Border Fleet understood deterrence as a function of visible warships, United Earth had built a deterrent that required no visible presence at all, that had been quietly, legally, and entirely undetected accumulating inside the very stations most likely to eventually need correcting. For the simple reason that any station engaged in small habitual extraction over enough years would, statistically, eventually receive enough Vela deliveries to host a threshold presence sufficient to answer it. 41 nodes at Ashkeleth was, by Threshold's internal standard, an unusually rich deployment. It had not been engineered that way. It was simply what 9 years of Prevault Wren's specific pattern of behavior had produced. Enough seized cargo processed and stored rather than promptly returned or destroyed, to leave enough threshold hardware sitting quietly in Ashkeleth's own holding bays to do exactly what was about to be done to it. The broader network, of which Ashkeleth's 41 nodes represented a single, unusually dense cluster, extended across every station Vela Transit Solutions had serviced in 19 years of operation, a fact that not even Admiral Webb held the complete picture of, because complete pictures were exactly the kind of centralized vulnerability Threshold's architects had designed the system to avoid. No single terminal, no single officer, and no single database contained a full map of every dormant node across every corridor. Dr. Nkosi Webb's desk held authority over activation in the Thessaly sector specifically. 6 other desks, scattered across UEDC's Corridor Oversight Division and known to each other only by designation rather than location, held equivalent authority over 6 other sectors. This compartmentalization had been argued over fiercely during the program's original design, with several senior officers contending that centralized control would allow faster, more coordinated response. Admiral Webb had overruled them, citing the same principle that had governed every other choice in the program's architecture. A deterrent that could be discovered and disabled in a single stroke was not a deterrent at all. It was a liability wearing a deterrent's clothing. A deterrent built from thousands of small, independent, redundant pieces, none of which knew enough about the others to compromise the whole if captured or exposed, was slower to activate and immeasurably harder to ever fully unmake. This was, in its own way, the same lesson Vela Transit Solutions itself embodied at a larger scale. No single ship mattered. No single captain, no single crew, no single delivery carried more than the smallest fragment of the whole. The strength was never in any one part. It was in the patient, distributed accumulation of thousands of ordinary, unremarkable parts over 19 years, across a genuinely enormous volume of ordinary commercial space, until the aggregate quietly became something no single military planner on the other side of any given border had ever been trained to look for, because no hostile power in the region's recorded history had ever bothered to build anything like it. Warships were countable. Fleets could be surveilled, tracked, and weighed against one's own. A shipping company's cargo manifests were, by contrast, the least interesting thing in the galaxy to study, which was, again, precisely the point. The engineers who had originally designed the node hardware, a small classified division within UEDC's Materials Science Directorate that operated, itself, under a cover identity almost as thorough as Vela's own, had spent the first 3 years of the project simply solving the problem of dormancy. How to build an instrument capable, once activated, of assuming total administrative control over a target system, while remaining, for years or even decades beforehand, completely indistinguishable from ordinary industrial hardware to any inspection short of full structural disassembly. The solution they arrived at was, in the tradition of everything else about Project Threshold, almost aggressively unglamorous. The nodes were built, quite literally, out of the same base components as the environmental regulators they were designed to resemble, modified only in ways that left no external signature and required no independent power source, drawing what little energy they needed for passive listening from the same systems they were embedded within, and reserving their own stored capacity entirely for the single, brief burst of activity that activation would eventually demand. A node could sit untouched and unsuspected for the full lifespan of the housing it was built into, which in practice meant anywhere from a handful of years to, in a small number of documented cases, considerably longer, limited only by how long a given piece of cargo housing happened to remain in circulation before being recycled or destroyed. This longevity was not accidental generosity on the part of the engineering team. It was the direct consequence of a design philosophy that assumed, correctly, that the specific moment any given node would be needed could not be predicted in advance, and that the only honest way to build a deterrent against an unpredictable future wrong was to make the deterrent itself patient enough to outlast the uncertainty. Dr. Nkosiweb had once described the entire program, in a lecture she gave to a closed audience of incoming corridor oversight analysts years after Ashkalith, as the most expensive act of institutional faith the United Earth Defense Command has ever funded, by which she meant that every single node deployed across 19 years and 11 corridors had been built, shipped, and quietly embedded without any guarantee it would ever be used at all, on the simple wager that somewhere eventually one of them would be needed, and that when that day came, having built it in advance would matter more than any amount of force assembled afterward ever could. Dr. Nkosiweb authorized activation at 2:12 hours, 4 hours before the original 96-hour window would have closed, 10 hours after Fleet Marshal Threll's rejection had been received. She did not consult the Marshal's rejection for permission. Threshold doctrine did not require an enemy's agreement to proceed. It required only that every reasonable opportunity for the enemy to avoid the consequence had been genuinely offered, which it had. The activation signal traveled through ordinary Concord relay infrastructure, disguised, as it had been designed for 19 years to be disguised, as routine environmental telemetry. It reached all 41 Ashkalith nodes within 11 seconds of each other. None of them were weapons. This mattered, and it was, in a sense, the entire point. Project Threshold had never built its dormant network to destroy anything. It had built it to demonstrate with total and irrefutable clarity that it could have. Each node, once active, did exactly one thing. It took full, itemized, time-stamped control of every automated system in Ashkalith's customs and holding operations, precisely long enough to perform a single administrative act, and then relinquished control entirely. The act was this: every seizure record Prevault Wren had filed in 9 years, 6 crews, dozens of cargo manifests, was pulled from the station's archive, cross-referenced against the original transit logs Threshold had been quietly compiling in parallel for the entire same period, and republished simultaneously across every internal Concord Customs terminal on Ashkalith Station, with every fabricated discrepancy flagged, dated, and attributed by name to the officer who had filed it. Prevault Wren was asleep when it happened. He woke to find his entire office terminal and every other terminal on the station displaying the same document, a complete, precisely footnoted audit of 9 years of his own professional conduct, including the 4-minute discrepancy that had never existed, the 6 prior detentions that had never been reported, and the pattern, laid out with a clarity no internal Concord review had ever previously bothered to assemble, of a customs officer who had spent nearly a decade quietly stealing from anyone too far from home to complain. It was not an attack. Nobody was hurt. No system was destroyed. No weapon had been fired. It was, in the most literal sense available, an audit delivered with impossible precision by an adversary who had apparently been capable of delivering it at any point during the previous 9 years and had chosen, until this exact moment, not to. The effect on Ashkeleth Station was not panic. It was something quieter and, for Prevault Wren personally, considerably worse. It was immediate, station-wide, irreversible professional exposure, conducted with a thoroughness that made any attempt to minimize, explain away, or bury the record functionally impossible, because the record now existed, permanently timestamped, on the personal terminal of every officer on the station, including several who reported not to Wren but directly to Regional Director Korum's office, and who forwarded copies within minutes. Out of the same reflexive career self-preservation that had let the original extraction continue unchecked for 9 years. By the time Korum received the forwarded audit, 11 separate officers on Ashkeleth had already independently reported it to 11 separate oversight channels. There was, this time, no ambiguous chart to interpret, no rumor to weigh against career incentive. There was a complete, internally generated, mathematically precise record of exactly what Wren had done, exactly when and exactly to whom, delivered by a mechanism that made unmistakably clear the delivering party could have exposed it at any time in the past 9 years, and had chosen restraint until restraint had been formally, explicitly rejected. Korum understood, reading it, something Fleet Marshal Threll had not permitted himself to consider, that the demonstration had not been aimed at the fleet at all. It had never required a warship to make its point. It had been aimed at the exact bureaucratic incentive structure that made small habitual extraction profitable in the first place, and it had dismantled that structure with a single administrative act more effective than any military threat could have been, because it had made the actual cost of extraction, for the first time in 9 years, personally and permanently visible to every single person whose silence had allowed it to continue. She released the 12 detainees within the hour. She did not wait for Fleet Marshal Threll's authorization, because she had, by that point, correctly concluded that Threll's judgment on this matter carried considerably less weight than her own continued employment. The Meridian Accord's registration was cleared, its cargo forfeiture reversed, and a replacement shipment of the decayed medical isotopes was authorized from Ashkeleth's own regional stores as partial restitution, a gesture that went slightly beyond what Threshold's demand had technically required, offered, Korum would later admit in her own internal report, entirely in the hope of establishing that this particular customs office, unlike its administrator, understood exactly how quickly and thoroughly an account could be closed once someone with actual authority decided to close it. Korum spent that same hour doing something she had not done in the preceding 9 years of Wren's tenure at Ashkeleth. She personally reviewed his complete service record, cross-referencing it, this time, against the threshold-generated audit rather than against Wren's own self-reported summaries. What she found unsettled her more than the audit itself had, because it revealed not a single rogue officer acting alone, but a pattern of institutional indifference that extended, in smaller and more diffuse ways, through at least 4 other stations under her nominal authority. She had signed off over the years on dozens of forfeiture reports from those stations, without once asking the kind of question Ilarak had asked her about the threshold chart. She understood, reading Wren's file with new eyes, that she had been exactly the kind of official the entire architecture of small, unaccountable extraction depended on. Not malicious, not even particularly negligent by the standards of her peers, simply too comfortable in a system that had never once been tested to bother testing it herself. This realization did not appear anywhere in her official report. It appeared only in a private memorandum she wrote to herself and never sent to anyone, a habit she had picked up from watching more cautious officers survive career-ending incidents by leaving as little written trail of their private doubts as possible. But it changed, in ways her subordinates would see without ever being able to name precisely the way she ran her remaining 8 years at Regional Customs Command. And by the time she retired, the 72-hour foreign detainee notification review she implemented in Ashkeleth's aftermath had quietly become the most closely audited procedure in her entire region, a fact she never publicly connected to the incident that had prompted it. Fleet Marshal Threll attempted, for approximately 6 hours, to characterize the incident as a conquered internal administrative matter unrelated to any external pressure. This position became untenable the moment Regional Director Korum's own report, filed independently and without his review, made explicit reference to the threshold demand, the rejected ultimatum, and the precise 14-hour gap between his rejection and the exposure that followed it. A conquered internal review board, convened 3 weeks later, would find that the Fleet Marshal's assessment of the threat had been, in the board's precise phrasing, professionally negligent in its confidence and catastrophic in its consequence. A finding that ended within the month, an unblemished 11-year command record on the strength of one afternoon's contempt for a shipping chart. The review board's proceedings, though sealed at a clearance level considerably above what most conquered personnel would ever hold, included testimony from both Vithra Corson and Davis Corinth, the intelligence officer who had urged caution and the operations officer who had not. Corson's private log, the one she had kept out of long habit rather than any expectation it would ever matter, was entered into the record in its entirety, and it became, in the years that followed, required reading for every incoming Third Border Fleet intelligence officer, not because it had prevented anything, but because it demonstrated with uncomfortable clarity exactly how much a documented, timely warning was worth when the person receiving it simply chose not to listen. Corinth's career survived the review, though only barely, and he would spend the following decade privately regarding his own validation of Threll's dismissal as the single most consequential mistake of his professional life, a judgment history would ultimately, and not unfairly, uphold. Corson herself was offered Threll's vacated command within the year, an offer she accepted with the same careful, unhurried deliberation she brought to every decision of consequence, and she would go on to serve as Fleet Marshal for the following 16 years without a single incident resembling Ashkeleth ever again occurring along her stretch of the frontier, a record she attributed whenever asked not to any particular brilliance of her own, but simply to having learned, once and permanently, exactly what a documented warning was worth when someone with the authority to act on it actually chose to read it carefully before deciding it did not matter. Prevost Wren was dismissed from Concord Customs Service within the week, his pension forfeited under the same forfeiture statute he had spent 9 years wielding against travelers who could not fight back. He would later, in a detail that made its way into the internal UEDC file more or less by accident, apply for and be denied a position at a private logistics firm operating in the same sector, a firm that, unbeknownst to him, held a minor subcontract with Vela Transit Solutions. He spent the remaining years of his working life in a considerably more modest position at a regional freight depot 2 systems away, a demotion in every practical sense, though he would occasionally tell colleagues, in moments of self-justifying reflection that none of them found especially convincing, that he had simply been doing his job the way it had always been done, and that the standards had changed underneath him without warning. The standards, in fact, had not changed at all. What had changed was that, for the first time in 9 years, someone with the capability to make the cost of his conduct visible had finally decided the moment had come to do so. Captain Idris Bello and his 11 crew were escorted from Ashkeleth's detention block to a waiting Vela shuttle by station personnel who offered, without instruction from anyone above them, a formal apology that none of them had been authorized to give, and that all of them gave anyway. Bello would later say, in the only interview he ever granted about the incident, that he had understood, watching the station staff's faces, that something larger than his own detention had shifted in that room, though it would be months before he learned, through channels considerably above his clearance, exactly what. Talia Osai stood at the shuttle's small viewport as Ashkeleth fell away behind them, watching the station shrink into an ordinary point of light among a great many other ordinary points of light, and found that she did not, in the end, feel the relief she had expected to feel. What she felt instead was something closer to the sensation of having been let in on a fact about the universe that she had not previously known to look for. That somewhere, in some office she would never see, on some world she would likely never visit, people whose names she would never learn had looked at a shipping delay and treated it, immediately and without hesitation, as a reason to act. She did not know, and never would fully know, how close that action had come to her own cargo housing, unloaded and stacked in a storage bay 40 meters from her cell. Nor would she ever learn that the very ship she had helped maintain for 3 years had, across 41 ordinary and unremarkable deliveries, quietly built the thing that freed her. "You were right," she said to Bello without turning from the window. Somebody knew. Bello did not ask her to explain what she meant. He had flown this corridor long enough to recognize the particular quiet of someone who had just stopped being young in one specific, permanent way, and he understood that the kindest thing available to him was simply to let her have the thought without disturbing it. He put a hand briefly on her shoulder instead, said nothing further, and let the shuttle carry them the rest of the way home in a silence that neither of them felt any need to fill. Admiral Marcus Webb received the final activity report at 6:40 hours, 4 hours and 28 minutes after activation, 38 hours before the original 96-hour window would have closed. He read it standing at the window of his office, the way he read every closed threshold file, because he had found over the years that reading them sitting down made them feel more like paperwork than they deserved to feel. 12 people returned, 1 ship returned, cargo restored with a gesture of restitution beyond what had been demanded, no shots fired, no casualties on either side at any point in the incident. 1 customs officer's 9-year pattern of quiet theft permanently and irreversibly ended not by force, but by the simple, devastating application of a truth he had spent 9 years assuming would never surface. 1 fleet marshal's career ended by his own contempt for evidence he had chosen not to examine. And buried in the report's final section, the number that Dr. Amara Nkosi-Webb had flagged specifically for her husband's attention. 41 nodes activated, 41 nodes fully expended, 0 nodes remaining at Ashkeleth Station. This was by design permanent. Threshold doctrine did not permit lingering presence once an account was closed. Every node that had activated had also, in the same operation, permanently and irreversibly erased its own capability, leaving behind nothing that any subsequent Conquered investigation, however thorough, could recover, repurpose, or use to claim that United Earth maintained an ongoing covert presence inside Conquered infrastructure. The demonstration had been total. The withdrawal was equally total. This was, Amara had always argued, the entire reason the doctrine worked. An adversary who believed the intrusion was ongoing would spend years searching for it, and years searching for a threat is not so different from years living under one. An adversary who could verify definitively that the intrusion had ended precisely when the wrong had been corrected and not 1 moment later, was an adversary who could be shown, over time, across enough incidents, that United Earth's restraint was not a tactic. It was the actual shape of the thing. Regional Director Quorum, months later, in a private communication routed through neutral channels that both sides understood was never meant to become public, and that neither side ever acknowledged, would ask the question that every Conquered official who survived contact with Project Threshold eventually asked in some form. How long, she wrote, were you inside our systems before you used it? The reply, drafted by Dr. Nkosi-Webb and sent under no official letterhead at all, was 3 sentences long. Long enough to know we did not need to use it against anyone who was not, personally and directly, responsible for the harm being corrected. Long enough to know exactly how much restraint that required. We are telling you this because the next customs officer who considers doing what Ren did should understand that the patience is real, and so is the account. There was no reply to that message. There did not need to be one. Within a year, the conquered Thessaly Corridor Customs Command implemented a mandatory 72-hour foreign detainee notification review, independently auditable by a rotating oversight officer with no reporting relationship to the station administrator. A policy change that conquered Prime's internal records attributed, without further elaboration, to operational lessons from the Ashkeleth incident. Vela Transit Solutions resumed its normal delivery schedule through the Thessaly corridor within the month. 41 deliveries became 42, then 43, then, over the following 3 years, 111 more, each one carrying, alongside its ordinary cargo, the same quiet, dormant, patient instruments it had always carried, because Project Threshold did not consider one closed account a reason to stop building the next one. It considered it confirmation that the method worked, and the method, built across 19 years and countless corridors far quieter than Ashkeleth's, had never once been about any single station, any single officer, or any single ship. It had been about a simple, unglamorous, almost bureaucratic proposition, one that no recruiting broadcast would ever be built around and no war memorial would ever be inscribed with, and that had nonetheless, quietly, corridor by corridor, become the single most effective deterrent United Earth possessed anywhere along its expanding frontier. That the true cost of wronging humanity's people was never announced in advance, never a matter of guesswork or bravado, and never, under any circumstance, negotiable. It was simply, patiently, and with total mathematical certainty, calculated. And then, when the moment came, it was paid. Talia Os left Vela Transit Solutions 4 years after the Ashkeleth incident, not out of any dissatisfaction with the company, but because the experience had redirected her, in the quiet and specific way that a single event sometimes redirects an entire career, toward the field of corridor security policy. She completed a graduate program at the University of Nairobi's Interstellar Affairs Institute, wrote a dissertation on deterrence architecture that her advisors found unusually sophisticated for someone with no formal military background, and eventually accepted a junior analyst position at UEDC's Corridor Oversight Desk. The same desk, though she would not learn this for another 2 years, that Dr. Amara Nkosi-Webb had occupied on the night the Ashkeleth demand was drafted. She met Nkosi-Webb properly for the first time at a policy retrospective convened on the 10th anniversary of the incident. A small, mostly unpublicized gathering of the handful of people across UEDC and Vela Transit Solutions who had been involved, in whatever capacity, in the events of that week. Talia recognized the name from files she had read as part of her own training long before she recognized the face. And when introductions were finally made, she found herself, for a moment, unable to say anything at all. "You were on the Meridian Accord," Nkosi-Webb said, not as a question. "You wrote the demand," Talia said. "I read 3 drafts of the doctrine in training before anyone told me it started with an actual ship, with actual people." "It always starts that way," Nkosi-Webb said. "The doctrine only exists because the ship was real first. We tend to teach it backward, doctrine before people, because doctrine is easier to structure a curriculum around. I've always thought that was a mistake." Talia asked her, later that evening, the question she had carried for a decade without ever having anyone qualified to answer it. "Did you know that night that it would work, or did you just believe it would, the way Bello believed somebody would come?" Nkosi-Webb considered this for a long moment, the particular kind of pause Talia would later come to recognize, across years of working alongside her, as the pause of someone who took the difference between knowing and believing seriously enough to never blur the two carelessly. "I knew the mathematics," she said. "I knew, to a very high degree of confidence, what 41 nodes could do, how fast they could do it, and how completely they could withdraw afterward. That part was knowledge." But whether Coram would act on what she saw, whether Threll's contempt would hold or crack, Whether the whole architecture of incentives we'd built the doctrine around would actually behave the way 19 years of modeling said it should when real people with real careers were suddenly staring at real consequences. That part, no. That part was always belief. It has to be. You cannot build a doctrine around certainty of other people's choices. You can only build it around making the right choice so obviously, overwhelmingly cheaper than the wrong one that most people, most of the time, will choose it. And then you have to actually believe every single time you use it that this time will be one of the times it holds. Has it ever not held? Webb did not answer immediately, and Talia understood from the specific quality of the silence that the answer existed and would not be shared at this table on this evening at this level of clearance. Not in a way that changed the doctrine, she said finally, which was, Talia recognized even then, not quite the same thing as no. Talia pressed gently, because she had learned by then that Webb respected a question asked twice or than a question dropped out of politeness. What happens when it doesn't hold? When you build the ledger and issue the demand and the other side simply doesn't blink, doesn't check, doesn't care what the audit says because the audit costs them nothing they haven't already decided they're willing to lose. Then you close the account anyway, Webb said, and you accept that closing it will cost more than it would have if they had simply returned what they took. That's built into the doctrine too, even if we don't teach that part in the introductory course. Proportional doesn't mean cheap. It means exact. Sometimes exact is expensive for both sides. We have never once represented this as a doctrine that guarantees a bloodless outcome. We represent it as a doctrine that guarantees the outcome will never be more than what the wrong actually cost, and that the other side will always, every time, have had a real and genuine opportunity to avoid it. Ashkeleth worked exactly the way it worked because Wren was a bureaucrat protecting a small extraction, not a fanatic protecting a belief, and Threll was a proud man protecting a reputation, not a commander protecting a homeland. Take away either of those conditions and the same doctrine produces a very different chapter. We know this. We have written that chapter too in files you do not yet have clearance to read. Talia sat with that for a long moment, turning her cup slowly in her hands, watching the small reflected lights of the retrospective hall's ceiling fixtures shift across the surface of her drink. Does it ever feel strange to you, she asked eventually, being the person who decides all of that? Sitting at a desk in Geneva, deciding what 41 dormant instruments do to a custom station 600 light-years away, based on mathematics you wrote yourself. Every single time, Webb said without hesitation, in a tone that told Talia she had asked herself the same question more times than she could count. If it ever stopped feeling strange, I think that would be the moment I'd know I needed to leave the desk. The doctrine only stays honest as long as the people running it remember that it's a choice made by people about other people, and not a machine that simply executes itself. Marcus used to say that the day threshold started to feel automatic, we should shut the whole program down and start over. Because automatic is exactly what turns proportional into excessive without anyone quite noticing the line get crossed. The two women sat together for a while longer, saying little else of substance, watching the other attendees of the retrospective drift between tables in the particular subdued, unhurried manner of people who had spent significant portions of their careers learning to be comfortable with silence. Talia thought, watching Webb across the table, of the 4-minute discrepancy that had never existed, of Wren's 9 years of small unaccountable theft, of the audit that had arrived at 2:12 hours and asked for nothing but the truth to be visible, and she understood more completely than any training course had ever managed to teach her exactly why the doctrine had been built the way it had been built, and exactly what it had cost. In patience and discipline and 19 years of ordinary cargo runs, to make sure that when the moment finally came, it worked. The Ledger of Ashkeleth was declassified to training clearance 11 years after the incident, taught in heavily redacted form, to every incoming corridor oversight analyst as the canonical case study in proportional deterrence doctrine. precisely because it contained no battle, no casualty, and no dramatic climax of the kind most military case studies were built around. It contained instead a shipping delay, a customs officer's 9 years of small unaccountable theft, a fleet marshal's contempt for a chart he had not bothered to study, and a quiet desk in Geneva that had simply, patiently, done exactly what it had spent 19 years being built to do. Talia taught the case herself years later to her own incoming class of analysts, and she always ended the lecture the same way, with the line Bello had said to her in a cell on Ashkeleth Station before either of them had any idea how the story would end. A line she had carried for the rest of her career because it had turned out, against every reasonable expectation, to be exactly true. Somebody knew, somebody always knew, and knowing was always in the end the first half of anything getting fixed. She would add in the later years of her teaching one further observation that was entirely her own, drawn not from any doctrine document, but from the particular vantage of having lived the incident first as a frightened 26-year-old engineer, and later as the analyst charged with training the next generation of desks like the one that had saved her. She told her students that the hardest part of Project Thres Hold was never the engineering, remarkable as it was, and never the mathematics of proportionality, exacting as they were. The hardest part, she told them, was the 19 years of ordinary work that came before any of it mattered. The routine deliveries, the unremarkable manifests, the thousands of small, unglamorous choices to build patiently toward a moment that might never come, made by people who would mostly never know whether their particular contribution had been the one that eventually counted. Bello had never known, flying his 41 routes, that he was building anything at all. Talia herself had not known, welding cargo housing into place on her third contract, that she was assembling the instrument of her own eventual freedom. This, she told her students, was the truest measure of the doctrine's design, that it asked nothing of the people who built it except that they do their ordinary jobs honestly and well, and it delivered, when the moment finally arrived, exactly what 19 years of that ordinary honesty had quietly made possible. She would close every year by telling them that this was the lesson worth carrying forward more than any formula in the classified appendix. That patience, applied honestly and without any promise of ever being needed, was itself a kind of strength that no fleet, however large, could ever quite replicate, and that the corridor, in its own quiet way, remembered exactly what that strength had cost to build. UEDC Archive Note: this file has been officially declassified to Tier 3 clearance for training purposes, cleared for instructional use across all corridor oversight training cohorts. Cross-reference Project Threshold operational files 2352 through 2371 for additional documented incidents following identical proportional response doctrine. Cross-reference Vela Transit Solutions Fleet Manifest for corridor deployment history. Fleet Marshal Osavane Threll's full review board transcript remains sealed at Tier 5.